So if we had to distill down the essence of Gloomhaven, the survival of Gloomhaven, and I know I'm simplifying things a little bit here, tactica-wise, but essentially if you run out of cards for your character, you are dead. Now, there's a couple of things we can do to mitigate that. The first, of course, being, in theory, although I do tend to pick up as much treasure as I can, but not taking damage in the first place, which means tactically working with the other players, or if you're playing solo and controlling 2 or 3 or 4 characters, looking a little bit ahead of time and figuring out how the opposing AI is going to activate, and taking a calculated risk based on your character initiative. And what we see with all the cards is a range of initiative. Some characters are inherently baseline faster than others. So based on the character that you're playing, having an idea of that range and sometimes gambling a little bit and saying, do I want to go before the monsters, before the AI, or can I allow them to go? We don't want to get caught where you're standing there surrounded by 3 monsters and you know that they're going to activate. It would be better to play a little bit more conservatively. But there are many, many factors with this. But tactically, that's kind of your first line of defense. When we get hit, a lot depends on the damage taken. Monsters do different amounts depending on their level, depending on regular or gold elite monsters. We have 2 choices: taking the damage on the life counter or discarding cards from our hand, a card from our hand on there. And the short rest or the long rest to regain cards, in many ways, that's also kind of suffering a wound, because at some point you're going to want to get those cards back into your hand. It's a question of having control over which card you discard, or randomly getting rid of a card, plus getting rid of poison, or dealing with healing yourself on that perspective on there. With the question for me is, when I first take damage, I like to try and keep my life counter around 5. Simply because that gives me a little bit of room. And the difference between taking 3, 4, 5 points of damage in one swing, or 1 point of damage in one swing, that's a big difference in getting rid of cards. I don't want to take 1 point of damage and discard a card. I'd want to take 5 points in a hit. I want the larger damage amounts. That's when I look to discard a card, as opposed to turning down the life counter. Naturally, I need to manage that a little bit with a long rest or maybe some ability with healing, and see where we go from there. So let's talk about making that tactica decision. And this is a little bit challenging, because I don't know what character you're playing, and I'm not going to name any of the characters, because beyond the base classes, I don't want to spoil any of that self-discovery and unlocks in Gloomhaven, because that's the other half of the game that's so amazing, these unlocks. But I also don't know, whether you're playing solo or with a group, what are the other characters in your party, and what level is the prosperity of Gloomhaven, what magic items do you have? There's a lot of variables. So we're looking at kind of a top-down overview to ask the questions to build this. I prioritize attacking first. Especially if it is specialized attacks where I can do 3 or more points of damage, 4 or more points of damage, because on the base deck, and I know it gets modified over time, but the base deck, for the most part, it's going to be +1 or -1 on there. I'm going to do a little more damage or a little less damage. So the chance to play a card generically for attack 1, or things where we'll see attack 1 and maybe it has some range, or it has attack 1 and generates an element, those aren't as strong. I want to prioritize the powerful attack cards and all attack cards, simply because that is the quickest way to cut down on dealing damage. And what I strive for, the question I ask is, can I put myself in a position tactically? Because Gloomhaven's a dungeon crawler, and we're looting, and we're doing the RPG thing, and we're unlocking things. But it is a tactical exercise in positioning and being aware of how and when things are going to activate, terrain and traps and line of sight and all this. I want to try and take out 1 enemy a turn. That's what I kind of focus on. What can I take out one a turn, either directly alpha, kill it, or if it's been wounded on another turn or through another player, what can I take out and at the same time not expose myself to damage from that perspective. So maybe it's if I'm surrounded, an attack and then a move, depending on the cards that are available. It might just be move, so then I can do a ranged attack next turn. But the attack for me is the priority. Second priority to that, and it's also kind of in there with the first, experience. A select number of cards, not only starting out, but as your character evolves, it's going to generate experience. That's absolutely vital. Being able to farm experience through the encounter is vital. And in many ways to level up, what's interesting is you tend to level up not really that quick in Gloomhaven, but it's easier at the lower levels. Then I find it slows down towards the mid levels, and you're like, I feel like I'm grinding back in my DDO days here, where I plateaued at level 16. I can't get any higher. I played my character Zonix for like forever, and finally making it to level 20. It's like it was insane. I feel that with Gloomhaven sometimes, where you make it to the mid-tier levels and you just hang out there for a while. And eventually, as you move into the higher levels, it's a catapulting effect, maybe to help unlock another character class or retire, where now in your hand of cards, what you have, it's very easy to select cards augmented by certain items to essentially generate experience every turn and kind of push that through there. But in the beginning, and as much as possible, even in the mid-game, I want to prioritize experience. So I don't want to get rid of cards that do that. There's a number of cards in your hand that are going to have the use and discard permanently out of your hand. They've got kind of that card symbol with the discard on there. Those are like special effect cards. I'm trying to think of the best way to explain it as you look through your decks. Those are things that are going to have persistent effects or supportive effects. They could be very powerful, but you need the right situation to unfold in the dungeon, where the attack and move cards, that's the bread and butter. So I am fine with discarding one of those cards that are going to have that take this conditional effect or take this effect and discard the card, simply because I'd rather keep in play all my attack and all my move. There are certain cards, I'm thinking of the Cragheart, that the special discard cards, there's a couple of like thunderous attacks, large attack cards that deal a radius of damage you use and you discard. Those are worth keeping. And I find early on, I guess this will lead into a second podcast, for characters that can deal damage and can deal damage across multiple hexes. And we see kind of two ways of hex damage dealing, where you have a centered hex and it'll be to the left or to the right, or center hex and two above, left and right, positioning where your character is. Or to a lesser extent, where you might have a little bit of range, one or two spaces, and then it'll drop a center hex and radiate out. At the beginning, especially if you're playing with a higher player count, the monsters tend to be packed together. They tend to be very, very open to being alpha striked with that. I will usually lead, and it is a little bit aggressive to immediately turn one, start discarding cards to the lost pile on there. I will go for that. I will play those disposable cards, often with some sort of potion to augment, base attack, hit four or five hexes in a radius, and I can catch two regular bandits and an elite gold bandit on there with a potion. So at the very least, before I flip my modifier cards, I'm dealing with this idea of +1 from the attack, or +2 or +3 base, +1 or +2 for the augmentation potion, and then I'm flipping a card. Yeah, I could, get a miss on there, or yes, I could deal with -2 to the effect, but likewise, I could deal with a crit, or I could deal with even a +1 or a +2 modifier card on there, that's going to alpha strike a lot of things. So I'm open to knowing when to possibly alpha strike. That's kind of, those are the questions that I ask as I'm looking and dealing with damage and hand management. And so much of the game, we pushed this up to a previous podcast. I looked at this idea. It's not only resource management. It's very Euro-like. A lot of people say that Gloomhaven is just a Euro dressed up as a dungeon crawling game. There's some element of truth in there, although there are heavy role-playing aspects. But if I had to pick one thing and say, hey, this is Gloomy, this is what the game is, it's against a set timer. As soon as you kick down that door or walk down those steps or step through the portal, whatever it's going to be, the timer against your character, the timer against the party has begun, and you're going to try and mitigate it, slow it down by when you take damage, deciding take the wounds or discard the cards.